and good morning, America. Welcome to the news. I am your honest anchor, Bud Stafford, and today we dive into the very interesting topic of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Today, on Halloween, October 31st, 1962. We have just received news that the Cuban Missile Crisis has been resolved after 13 strenuous days of being on the brink of a nuclear war. In the beginning of September, American spy planes discovered that the USSR was building surface-to-air missile launch sites. Also, an increased amount of Soviet ships were in Cuba, which the United States feared they were carrying a supply of weapons. President Kennedy decided that a naval blockade around the island of Cuba was the best resolution to solving the problem. With the world waiting, 3 out of every 5 Americans expected a nuclear war to break out. The Eyewitness has more on the story.
On September 27th, I went to a bar and Castro's personal pilot was there also. I sat a couple of seats away from him and so I could hear him speak. While talking to another man, he said Cuba now had nuclear missiles imported from the Soviet Union. I stayed at the bar until the pilot and his acquaintance left to see if they would talk about the missiles again. They also mentioned Cuba was expecting another shipload of missiles. After I overheard what Castro's pilot said, I informed my commander about this news, who then informed the White House of the development. I overheard no other information besides this news. This was important information because it provided proof that the Soviet Union was providing missiles to Cuba.
Thank you, unanimous eyewitness, for that information. And now, out to our other eyewitness.
I was at my home in Florida when we first received news about how the Soviet Union was helping out Cuba by giving them nuclear missiles. That's really scary because we only live something like 90 miles away from Cuba. I think it was on October 22nd. Yes, October 22nd, when President Kennedy spoke to the nation in a televised address, even though the crisis started on October 14th. I and so many other people who live in Florida live so close to Cuba, so if the Soviet Union decided to use the missiles, we would have been dead. I'm glad that President Kennedy handled the situation the way he did.
Thank you. To go further into detail, Cuba was in a position where they could shoot down American U-2 spy planes. President Kennedy gave the okay for the U-2 planes to fly over Cuba, but he made them take precaution, like to avoid flying over the entire island. During the flight, the planes took some pictures that showed some unusual activity in San Cristobal, which is located on the eastern part of Cuba. It wasn't until October 15th when pictures were taken and revealed that the Soviet Union was placing long-range missiles in Cuba. President Kennedy's first reaction was to call a meeting, and Robert S. McNamara, Secretary of State for Defense, attended that meeting, and here today discuss what we're doing during that meeting.
I'm here today. During the meeting, 14 men attended that included military leaders, experts on Latin America, representatives of the CIA, cabinet ministers, and personal friends whose advice Kennedy valued. We met a couple more times over a few days, and we discussed different strategies on how to deal with this crisis on our hands. Our first option was to do nothing and ignore the missiles in Cuba. Missiles in several countries close to the Soviet Union, so it was only fair that the Soviet Union had missiles in Cuba. Another tactic we thought of and used was to negotiate.
What did you negotiate for?
If the Union got rid of the missiles in Cuba, we would withdraw our missiles from Italy and Turkey. The next idea was invasion. Then we thought of a blockade. The United States Navy would stop military equipment from reaching Cuba from the Soviet Union. We also thought of bombing missile bases or to use nuclear weapons against the Soviet Union. We decided not to use those strategies because we didn't want a nuclear war to break out.
Tactics did you use?
To use a naval blockade and negotiation. President Kennedy announced to the American people that he had ordered a naval blockade of Cuba on October 22nd. On October 27th, one American U-2 spy plane was shot down. We decided it was time. under Khrushchev's letter and negotiate with the Soviet Union.
Thank you for your time, sir.
Oh, thank you for having me.
As well as a naval blockade, President Kennedy also told the Air Force to prepare attack on Cuba and the Soviet Union. The Army positioned 125,000 men in Florida. If the Soviet ships were carrying weapons for Cuba, a war was likely to begin. President Kennedy promised that if one of the U-2 planes were fired upon, he would give orders to attack the Cuban missile sites. One of the U-2 planes was shot down, but Kennedy did not follow through with his plans. Today we have the privilege to talk to Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union.
Thank you for having me today. During this whole ordeal, we, the Soviet Union, were just trying to help another communist brother out. We had no intentions of using the missiles, but they were there just in case, just how the United States had nuclear missiles near our country. On October 24th, I sent a letter to President Kennedy explaining how he was creating a crisis in order to help the Democratic Party win the upcoming elections. 2 days later, I sent another letter stating that we would be willing to remove the missiles from Cuba if the U.S. promised not to invade. The next day, I sent a letter demanding they remove their nuclear base from. Kennedy accepted the terms of our letters, and we ended up getting our way. I stuck with my promise and gave orders for the missiles to be dismantled.
Thank you for that information. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the first and only nuclear confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union. This event frightened both sides, and it changed the development of the Cold War forever. Thank you for watching this segment. I'm your honest host, Buzz Stafford, and I also like to party.